Curious about vegetables? Talk to Iswesid. Hello everyone, welcome to Around the VegTable. I'm Lysette Lacambra and your host for this program. In today's episode, we're joined by Dr. Micha Gracianna Devi, I hope I pronounced that well, who will share the topic on green manure cover crop, cultivating resilience in agriculture. So Dr. Micha works as an action researcher at Wageningen University Research, focusing on green manure, cover crops, and insect pest resistance. She holds a PhD from the Leibniz, I hope I also pronounced that, Institute for Technology in Germany, and has over 2.5 years of postdoc experience in molecular plant breeding. She has initiated projects such as developing AI-based phenotyping methods for insect assay with the robotics group of Wageningen under the top sector granted INSPIRE project, and an AI-based trichome quantification tool in collaboration with Indonesia University in Yogyakarta. Additionally, she holds a master's in plant biotechnology from WUR and completed exchange programs in Thailand and Spain during her bachelor's in agronomy and horticulture from IPB University in Bogor, Indonesia. So what an impressive academic track record, Micha, and aside from being a good friend of mine. So I welcome you to this webinar and thank you for accepting our request to share this topic. So I'm now giving you the virtual floor.
Okay, thank you, Lysette, for the kind introduction, and thank you, VegTable, for having me to share about green manure cover crops cultivating resilience in agriculture. It's nice to see that there are a lot of people from different countries, so I hope that there's a lot of take-home messages from my presentation, and this can help you also to understand the use of green manure cover crops, especially in agriculture practices. So coming from a plant breeding background, we are always thinking about phenotype. The phenotype is the actual, for instance, observation factor, for instance, the yield of a crop, or the appearance of tomato fruits is, for instance. But of course, in terms of phenotype, you get the phenotype when there's the genetic background, and there's also the environmental effect. In this case, we can, of course, create a nice tomato, but what happens when the environment is not suitable? And this is often the case, and therefore, even if you have a high-quality seed, but you do not know how to cultivate it correctly and provide sufficient nutrients, in the end, they will not produce well. And therefore, I would like to share about one important topic, which is about soil fertility problem. Nowadays, we all know about climate change issues, but not only that, of course, you have environmental factor causing a lot of abiotic and biotic pressure or stresses for plants or crops to grow. And in terms of abiotic stresses, you can also think of different factors, temperature, even water availability, or certain other climatic changes. But in this case, we focus on soil. And soil fertility is important in the end. Why? Because plants grow on these soils and they have to extract a lot of nutrients for them to grow and develop well. But in reality, based on a survey conducted by UNEP, this is a nice illustration, a brief illustration about the condition of soil degradation, and about 1/3 of soil in the world are categorized as degraded to very degraded soil. And this, you can see a lot of regions, especially in the tropical regions, in Africa, South America, and in Asia. And it has been a lot of problem, causing a lot of pressure, not only for farmers, but also for the environment, how people would also live, and also how they are able to sustain themselves due to these issues. And we have these problems also causing, for instance, attention in the media. in this case I took from Uganda since I was recently there, that it's also a major focus that Ugandan soil fertility is declining. And so if we know that there's this problem, what would be the solution, or how can we manage agriculture in a better way? So in here, I illustrate, or I adapted this table from literature and stating about the agronomical soil budget of nitrogen, because you know that there are a lot of elements in the soil, different nutrients, but you have common or major nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, as also potassium. But focusing on nitrogen, which is an essential component of soil fertility, and it is vital for supporting plant growth and development, as one element that we would like to also delve in deeper and to see how can we are able to manage or maintain nitrogen level in the soil so that they are able to provide sufficient nitrogen available for the plant to grow and develop better. Over the years, based on this survey, that in China and India, they have given a lot of, or sustainingly input or supplied nitrogen as input, maybe in the form of chemical fertilizer, but also maybe using cover crops and so on. But then you also observe in the red line that there's also not as much as agriculture output that you get. So the nitrogen that have been inputted is not all are being retained or harvested, and that's why you have this agriculture budget, which means that there's a gap, a certain gap, that we don't know where this nitrogen is going, but we know that it is not being absorbed well in the system, and it could be because of leaching. It could also be because of that these nitrogens are eroding along with the soil into water, and they're not used efficiently. And compared to sub-Saharan Africa, here, over the years, there's not a lot of nitrogen being given in the soil. And the reason for that is because could be the supply of nitrogen fertilizer that is not as intensive or available as countries such as China and India. But this can give us a hint what is the current status of nitrogen availability within these countries. There are different activities that can be conducted or be involved in order to enhance nutrient management and soil fertility, especially in vegetable production. A lot of people would suggest, or a lot of extension would suggest as well, that once a farmer would like to start cultivation, it's really important to have information on the soil nutrient content. And therefore, what we would suggest is, of course, to do soil testing, because with that information, one would be able to know what's the composition of the soil, what needs to be added, what's not need to be added, and what kind of plan can be designed in order to have a balanced fertilizer and a nice organic matter management plan. Another activity, you can also use mulches in order to retain, for instance, soil moisture, prevent also weed growth, as well as maintain the temperature, as mulches play also an important role in nutrient management. But of course, what we observe a lot in Asia, that when you put a lot of, or you use a lot of these plastic mulches, we'd also think as a lot of waste, plastic waste, and therefore we would need to also understand how to be able to manage this better. And fourth is green manure cover crops, which we will discuss further in this presentation, in this webinar. But related to green manure cover crops, it's not a new innovation, but it has been used over the years. But it has shown that using green manure cover crops with a combination of different methods and systems, it can help definitely in terms of supplying nitrogen and nutrients in the soil for the crops to grow. Fifth is conservation tillage. There are also a lot of cases where people or farmers, they are shifting from conventional tillage system to no tillage, or also to minimum tillage. And this is nice for them, so that in the end you can retain a nice compaction of soil. And in the end also, if you think about labor, then there's labor that needs to be needed to till the soil. You have also point 6, which is about crop rotation. because crop rotation is really important, of course, in order for farmers to be able to cut off, for instance, a pest and disease cycle. In tropical regions, it's a bit more tricky because we always have hot season or cold season, and this is maybe rainy or sunny weather. But in Europe climate, we have the 4 seasons, and therefore crop rotation is slightly differently managed or applied compared to a tropical region where the temperature is relatively warmer, constantly warm all the time, and it's difficult then how to coordinate the time. Fourth is precision agriculture. It's also an activity which nowadays you have a lot of digital tools that can help you in order to predict, for instance, how much fertilizer to use, what kind of pesticides to be applied, or how much of pesticides applied in the field. But of course, with precision agriculture, you would need this knowledge and you would need training in order to know how to use the technique, and this would require additional, let's say, investment. Point 8 is agroforestry and ecology. Combination of principles of agroforestry and ecology can help maintain biodiversity, and this is also helpful in maintaining a nice management system in your field. Ninth is farmer training and extension and service. This is what Katie has been doing, helping and supporting local farmers through trainers and extension field officers. And this, you can really see over the years how it developed, how the farmers are able to grow and how they are able to produce better vegetables within the region that they are in. And lastly is research innovation. And research and innovation is something that is always ongoing, and you need this in order to improve, in order to test. And of course, when it's research and innovation, there's always the learning process, which is important. First, I'd like to have a checkpoint. So there will be a few checkpoints in this webinar as requested by Lysette. What is a green manure cover crop? Is it a type of compost made of organic matter, a crop grown primarily to improve soil fertility, type of biological pesticide used to control weeds, and in agriculture field, a method of conserving water in agriculture field? So the correct answer is a crop grown primarily to improve soil fertility. It's quite tricky, I can imagine, when you think about, oh, it's a type of compost, but actually it's not really a compost, because compost means that you need to process it further in order for later on, then you insert it back in the field. So there's a bit of trickiness here. And see, a type of biological pesticide. I can imagine for those who are thinking about biological pesticide, but it's not specifically as a biological pesticide. It can indeed attract natural enemies or repel pests, but it's not directly a biological pesticide. So it depends on the type of crop that you are talking about. So I hope that is clear. So I would recap a bit what is a green manure cover crop. So green manure cover crop is fertility building crops. Green manure cover crops are plants, for sure, and they are used to cover and improve the soil, and as it positively impact the ecology of the land and other crop plants. And one of the primary uses of GMCC, so green manure cover crops, I say it in short, is that it accumulates nutrients, particularly nitrogen, to provide the main crop, which will usually be grown after the cover crops or in between, if you would like to have it as well as intercropping, so that the main crop in the end would have more nutrients in terms of nitrogen, for instance, and it can then contribute overall to the soil fertility, which in the end, farmers or growers would consider to reduce the need for synthetic fertilizer in replacement for the nitrogen that has been captured, provided by the green manure cover crop. But of course, green manure cover crops, they are grown to accumulate nutrients to provide for the main crops and improve soil productivity. But there are also some drawbacks which maybe you would recognize when one would consider to grow cover crops, because farmers would think, oh, if I would grow cover crops, then there would be less income for my main crops, or I would have to lose 2 months in order to grow these cover crops. So all these considerations are there, but then bear with me, because maybe it will change your mind when I come in the end about explaining more about the benefits of cover crops. So how green manuring works, why I would like to explain about green manuring, because this will explain about the process of how you use green manure cover crops. Farmers would start growing the green manure seeds, and they would also have to consider when they would start growing it, what kind of green manure seeds they would like to grow. You would also have to consider about avoiding competition with your intercropping it with other crops, or especially your main crops. And not to mention the growth conditions, because maybe you have heard of companion cropping, that if you decide to have this as a relay or have the cover crops as intercropping, then might be some limitations that you are not able to, it's better or recommended not to intercrop or apply this certain cover crop with your main crop. Second, once you have sown this green manure, you wait until it grows, but you have to make sure when to terminate the cover crop, because if you keep on going, then you'll be able to harvest the seeds, for instance, in the case of legumes, but then there are some drawbacks in terms of the hardiness, which means that once you terminate it, then it will be incorporated in the soil, and it might take more time than expected, and a lot of nutrients which are there available during the vegetative stage are maybe already gone because they have been converted, and a lot of the biomass is converted into the harvested product. So of course, in the end, for green manure cover crops, consider cutting them before flowering if you really want to have them as green manure. Then you would terminate. As I mentioned previously, think about the termination method, when to terminate, how to terminate it, the fragment, how to incorporate it in the soil. Lastly, once the cover crop has been terminated and incorporated in the soil, then you would be able to start sowing and also determining or when to plant your actual crop. There are different types of cover crops, and there are categories that we can put them in. First is grasses, and you have legumes, you have brassicaceae, you have also the brassicas, you have also the non-legume broadleaves. Just a bit of an idea of what is the difference between these different types of cover crops. In terms of grasses, you can imagine that for grasses, as an example, sorghum or sesame, they are known for the ability to hold onto nitrogen, and they are able to make this nitrogen available for the next crop. But you can imagine that they are also fast in growing, which makes them quite nice if you really want them in a short period of time to incorporate it in the soil. But in terms of biomass and nitrogen fixation, they are not having this role. In the case for legumes like sunham or veg, they are particularly available or valuable for their nitrogen fixing abilities, which in the end allow them to enhance soil fertility and reduce, in the end, synthetic fertilizer. They increase, of course, a lot of microbial activity in the soil, as these microbes play the important role for fixing the nitrogen and providing them for the plants. Compared to grass, you need to invest a bit more cost because the seeds may cost more than grasses. Then you have the brassicaceae, and the brassicaceae, for instance, you have radishes, you have turnips. They have a benefit in a way that they can also suppress soil pests. They can also prevent the growth of soil pests, which the end can clear or make the soil better or less contaminated or less stressful for the next crop to grow. And they can, of course, break compaction, soil compaction. They can improve rainfall infiltration, which is beneficial for the soil condition to be prepared for the next crop. And of course, the last one, the type of cover crops, you have non-legume broadleaves. And as an example of non-legume broadleaves, I would give marigold or sunflower. They play a role not only just to cover the soil, but then they are also acting as a nice attractant. They can attract a lot of beneficial insects, which might be helpful in terms of maintaining the ecosystem and also the balance of the area of your land for cultivation. But what is interesting is that these types of plants, that they are allelopathic, which means that they secrete a lot of secondary metabolites from the roots, which in the end suppresses weeds growth, or in the end suppresses a lot of other plants that you don't want them to grow on your field. Now, focusing on legume cover crops, here I made a nice wheel. You would be able to understand or maybe have a better overview about the benefits, especially for legume cover crops. We can start off with improving rainfall infiltration, because you can imagine that, of course, with better soil and with nice coverage, that in the end, the compaction of the soil can be nice, and in the end, the water can also penetrate through, which makes the soil nice and moisture, and this available for the next crop. Secondly, to improve soil health, you can also build soil organic matter, because you can imagine there's a lot of microbial activity in the soil, so that in the end, the organic matter is nicely developed for the next crop. Can also reduce soil compaction, provide nitrogen for the next crop, and it has this what's called scavenging activity. Nice scavenging of nitrogens means that it can retain also the nitrogen in the soil so that it does not leach out easily. Dual purpose also as feed, because you can imagine that these legumes that you've grown can also serve as feed for animals that are maintained, for instance, cows or goats, as I see a lot in Africa, in Uganda specifically. Next is increased soil microbial mass. There are researches available that really compared between when you integrate cover crops and when you do not integrate or incorporate cover crops, that there's an increase in soil microbial composition. It changes as well, but also the population increases. But of course, this depends, because there, of course, a fluctuation depending on the availability of the cover crops and the stage of the cover crops. Helps control pests and disease. I will touch upon this later in the presentation of a number of examples of how cover crops can also play a role in disease control and pest control. Next, we have encourage pollinators and beneficial insects. I touched upon this also in the previous slide, that for flowering crops such as sunflower or marigold, they can really nicely attract pollinators and beneficial insects. Suppresses weeds, because you can imagine that as they cover the soil, then there will be less weeds growing. Economic return is a question that is often asked. And of course, when it comes with economic returns, or if you want to analyze cost and benefit, you really need to look at case-by-case scenario. And lastly, it increases the yield. When we come into understanding more about legume and the role of legumes in agriculture production, we have to also think that it's actually not the legumes that are fixing nitrogen, because nitrogens are available also in the air, but they are inert atmospheric form and in a gas form. And plants cannot extract it directly and then provide it for themselves. No. In fact, they need like a relationship, symbiotic relationship with rhizobium, for instance, or other rhizobacteria, which will in the end, they are the ones that are fixing the nitrogen and providing them, the plants, into a form such as ammonium or nitrate that can be used by the plants. And this is usually measured through nitrogen fixation rate, it's called, which is the speed or the efficiency in which nitrogen is converted from the non-use form into a form that can be directly used by the plant. And this fixation rate can vary between different legumes and also vary between different plots. Why? Or different farmers? Because it depends on management practices. You can imagine also the different cultivars and the different types of crops that you're using. Also, the condition of the initial soil. How is it different from the one location to another? Climatic issues, also climate differences, as well as the type of rhizobacteria. Because there are compatibilities between different types of crops or species of plants with different types of rhizobacteria. And therefore, there are also a lot of researchers, and you can also look this information up in order to see which type of bacteria or rhizobacteria strains that are more effective in combination with the cover crops that you are going to implement in the field. Now, the next quiz or checkpoint is, which arrow represent rhizobium? Is it red or blue? Correct answer is blue. Why is it blue? Maybe for those of you have seen this in the field, you can know, but then when you are not used to looking at it in the field, this is what you see. Yeah, when you open these nodules, you can see a nice red color. which means that there's a lot of activity of rhizobium inside. And the reason for this reddish color is because there's a substance called leg hemoglobin. And what it does is that it prevents oxygen to enter these nodules, so that there's a lot of nitrogenase activity inside, which in the end captures the nitrogen, and in the end converting it in a form which will later be available for the plant. And in return, these rhizobiums, which are inside these nodules, they get carbohydrates, for instance, from the roots. To understand nitrogen fixation, because previously okay, you need the rhizobium, you need the plant, you also need to know about the nitrogen fixation rate. But when to incorporate then legume cover crops, what is the right time and how, especially when you know more or less the composition of your soil. So here's a nice illustration that you have soil unavailability from less to abundant. When you grow plant in a land or soil that has less or not that much, or least amount of nitrogen content in the soil, then there will be a lot of microbial activity, because it forces then the bacteria to produce and to fix a lot of nitrogen. And this is different when you compare to plants when you start to grow them in a land or in a soil that has high nitrogen availability, because then the plants say, okay, there's already a lot of nitrogen in the soil, then I don't have to put a lot of effort in the end, and the microbes don't have to put a lot of effort producing nitrogen in addition to what is already there. Therefore, there's principle that N fixation decrease as soil and fertility increases. And that's the role of one of the benefits of when you want to use legume cover crops. And the consideration is that if you know that your land needs more nitrogen, then you would be able to get more benefit out of it. And related to that, this table, which shows the time on the x-axis and available soil nitrogen. Now, why is it important to incorporate GMCC at the appropriate time? Because from this table, as I mentioned, that you have the time on the x-axis and y, which is available soil nitrogen. There's this curve which represents more or less what stages or what phases that your crop or your legume cover crop incorporation would be at. If you would incorporate cover crop, in this case a cover crop that's already is already super hardy, then it will take more time for the microbes to utilize and to tie and also to degrade these materials. During this immobilization time, the microbes, they utilize the N. Instead of providing the N, they utilize the N in the soil. They utilize the N and from the soil, and in the end, if you would consider to put your main crop within this phase, then you would have to add a lot more nitrogen, and therefore you may see in the field that when I add cover crops and I integrated and incorporated my main crop at this phase, that in the end I get a reduction of yield compared to, or the phenotype is not that good compared to even the control, because you can imagine that you are accidentally or not knowingly adding or incorporating your main crop when it's still in the immobilization phase. But when you know that your crop is already in the mineralization phase, which means that there's already a release in nitrogen for the plant to take, and the microbes are not actively anymore fixating the nitrogen, then this is the correct time, because then your main crop that are grown in this stage or in this phase would be able to absorb all this nitrogen instead of competing with the decomposition of your cover crops. So I know maybe this raises some questions. So after a few more slides, when we have the question and answer session, if you would me to go to recap over this, then please let me know. So the next question.
For these three, for the immobilization and the mineralization part, if I can have more clarification,
Mineralization part. Okay, so first of all, if you want to understand, there's this dynamic of nitrogen in the soil and related to the mineralization and immobilization, So if the green manure cover crops, you incorporate it too early, and when, for instance, the plants are too hardy still, then it will take a longer time for the plant to for the incorporated green manure to degrade, and also that the microbes that are degrading and later on providing the nitrogen for the next cover crop, it needs time. So because the microbes, they will take time and take the nitrogen from the soil and not from the decomposing of the plants, of the legume cover crops. And therefore, if you were to incorporate your main crop at this phase, then it's a bit also like competing, because the degradation of the legume cover crops and the bacteria that are interacting with these legume cover crops, they are still taking up a lot of nitrogen. And this is different when you are incorporating it in the mineralization phase, because when it's in the mineralization phase, then the plants are not longer degrading that much, or even it's not longer degrading as much as previously, and that the bacteria, they will not use that much nitrogen from the soil, because they will start in the end providing later on this nitrogen for the plant to take up. So that's why it's important for you to incorporate or select a time point. When do you want to incorporate, or when you should incorporate your cover crops, so that you are able to provide sufficient nitrogen for your actual cash crop. There's no right or wrong answer, because sometimes one would prefer, I would like to have more time because I would like to grow the plant a bit older so that I can, for instance, extract maybe the seeds, and then in the end you just left with the leftover materials, but then of course there's not much nutrients anymore. But then one can also consider to cut it shorter, so just right before the flowering stage, when the stem are still succulent and not that hardy, so that in the end all the nutrients or all the nitrogens that are already extracted by the fixation or fixed by the bacteria, it will be available for the next crop. So in that sense, is it understandable?
Thank you. Clear.
Yeah.
Hello,
Okay.
Micha. Sorry.
Yes.
I think it's also related to the question of Sebastian. Similar one. So I think it answered the question of Sebastian on when or how do you incorporate the green manure compost into the soil for even distribution. And then the next question, when can the cash crop be sown or transplanted after incorporating? So I hope that clears Sebastian from this slide.
Okay, so just a bit last statement is that there's no right or wrong answer, that you should have incorporate your cover crop or your main crop later on during the immobilization or mineralization stage. It's really depend in the end of preference. But of course, you would want to have the nitrogen, the optimal nitrogen available for the crops as soon as as the crops start growing, so that you don't miss this time point. And if not, then you would have to add more or additional nitrogen or additional nutrients on the side of the legume cover crops that you have integrated in the soil. So it's also related to the degradation of the legume cover crops.
I just wanted to ask in this graph, I'm not sure if I didn't understand well, but I think during immobilization, it means that the cover crop is taking some of the nutrient from the soil, right?
Yeah, the microbes will utilize it, yes.
Okay, during mineralization, that means the cover crop will release the nutrient to the soil.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I expected our graph to go a bit higher in the mineralization, that we have more nutrients than before when we didn't plant the crop. But I see the graph is a bit like similar before immobilization and mineralization. It shows it's like there's no difference.
Okay, so again, this graph is just to illustrate about the phases, because I do not have the numbers. So maybe I should, in the end, yes, it really depends, because you can also imagine that there may be a certain extent that the amount of nitrogen being absorbed is also not as much as nitrogen that's being later on provided for the plant, because there are other factors such as maybe leaching or erosion. So you can imagine those other factors that can also play a role. So another checkpoint, which is the correct arrangement from fastest to slowest decomposition. So you have straws, grasses, or in the end, clover, veg, or peas. So would you expect grasses, clover, straw? In which arrangement would it be in terms of the speed of decomposition? The answer is C, which is correct, because you can imagine that clover veg peas in this case are still the plant itself. Therefore, they're faster in decomposition, and you have grasses, which are fresh grasses in this case. Maybe I should have mentioned at what stages that these plants and legumes and the grasses are, but you can imagine that in a vegetative phase, that in this case, the legumes, they decompose faster than grasses. And especially straws. And why? Because grasses and especially straws, straws are already really dehydrated and they're already very hardy, yeah? So that in the end, you have this different composition, which I will explain after this, related to breakdown of the different plant materials. When you understand and try to look deep into the stem composition, stems, they have composed of, in this case, hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin content. When you have a lot more lignin, a lot more carbohydrate, it becomes more tougher also when you eat or when you even touch. In the case of a bark, can know that there's a lot of cellulose, so that's why it's very strong and firm. But in case where we have plants that are still early in vegetative phase, especially in legumes, that different, if you wait for them to grow more hardy, it takes more time for them to break down. And that's for we end up coming into what's called a C/N ratio, which is called carbon-nitrogen ratio. Carbon-nitrogen ratio is a ratio where it's an estimated ratio where you have number of percentage of carbons over the nitrogen content. What is often happen is that if you have more nitrogen, there's faster breakdown and release of nutrients. And when you have more C content, it takes more time for degradation. There are also cases where you have also maybe phenolic compounds which may slow down the decomposition of the plant materials, but we do not look at that right now. But focusing on the C/N ratio, we can more or less in the end estimate the mineralization and the immobilization rates of the materials that you are integrating in the soil. So here are some examples. On the right, you have, it's from high carbon to low carbon, from right to left. And on the right, it's higher mobilization phase. And on the left, it's more towards the mineralization phase. And for straws and corn stalks, for instance, they have high carbon content, so that in the end, it takes more time to be in the immobilization stage compared to, for instance, clover, veg, or peas, because there are less carbon component inside the materials, and therefore it can release faster, release nitrogen faster. So this is one point that it's good for you to understand, that when you want to incorporate your cover crops, you have to know at what phase that you're incorporating them, which stage in mobilization or mineralization phase, and also the condition of the materials as well. Are they still vegetative or are they already towards generative phase? So from this materials until now, do you have any questions? Because Mr. Bean here from the legume division is asking if you have any questions.
I can ask from Sylvie, could letting a land fallow for one crop cycle or two be considered as a kind of green manuring?
In this case, it's not, because the essence of green manuring is you incorporate green manure, and if you're just keeping it fallow, you're just putting the land to rest.
There's a question from Mala. If we incorporate before growing main crop, would be better for the nutrient uptake?
Usually for green manure, we incorporate it before, indeed, the main crop or at the end of the main crop. But again, it depends again on the phases of whether it's in the mobilization stage or in the mineralization stage. And that is why we need to more or less estimate and have a gut feeling. And of course, this is by practice as well, because of course, if you rely on data from literature, it may vary from one to another. Usually when we incorporate, we have maybe 2-3 months before we grow the cover crops on the same land or the same plot, and then we terminate it, maybe leave it also for around 2 to 3 weeks before you actually start growing your main crop.
From Susheta, can you please suggest on integrating green manure cover crops into crop rotation schedules?
this actually, we had a session of this as well in Uganda training. So further explanation or further details on this, maybe then we have to create the next training, on-site training, because of course with cover crops, with rotations, you have to understand also have information on the typical schedule which are locally being used, the cropping schedule, the cropping rotation schedules, when farmers would grow on a high peak of tomatoes, for instance, or when they have or when they are because it's end of rainy seasons, then they have to they don't have sufficient water, then you can intentionally grow cover crops at that period of time. So there's a lot of considerations, especially with rotations.
From Ashik, have there any specific time of starting the mineralization of organic residue?
You need to check again, like that's why you need nitrogen check of the soil, because this is mostly the simplest method in order to know when is the amount of nitrogen that is high or low. So you need that information. But if I were just going in practice in the field, I would stick my head in and see how the condition of the legume cover crops that I'm incorporating, are they starting to degrade already, or are they still very hard and very hardy? So yeah.
Thank you very much, Micha, and thank you to all participants with your questions. Now we can proceed, and we still have sessions later on to answer few more questions. Thank you.
So why do we need to select the appropriate green manure cover crop? Because this is one of the questions that was also asked, I think. First is we need to identify primary objectives for adding cover crops to the system. So what are the primary objectives? Are you growing cover crops because you want to harvest also, for instance, the product of the cover crops, like maybe the legumes, you want to harvest also the beans afterwards or not? And what is it also is because maybe you want to retain the soil moisture, or also because you want to also attract natural enemies, or in the end prevent pests from coming. So it really depends what is your primary objective, and therefore to choose it, you have to at least have an idea and have some points about what is your main objectives of adding cover crops. Or is it just in the end to reduce the amount of synthetic fertilizer? That's also a reason. Second, identify the best time and place to fit cover crops in your rotation, and that was also a question. There was also a question before. In order to know the best time, of course, you would have to design first yearly plan, or if it's not possible a year, at least half a year would be best to in the end decide, and in the end when to exactly incorporate it and what stage of the cover crops you want to terminate. So it needs good time planning. Although in practice you of course have some changes that you just have to do it in an instant, and therefore you need this kind of feeling as well when you are in the field. Third is also related to the logistics, because you have to think, okay, if you want to plant a certain cover crop, are there the seeds available in your region? Are there the varieties that you want to use? And of course, in terms of logistics as well, do you have to additional effort to grow this? Maybe instead of using these 2 months, because I understand farmers, they often lend the lands from other farmers, and they only have limited amount of time where they can use it. So is there enough capital, or is it beneficial? Like in terms of cost and benefits, these are the things that farmers would think, of course. And lastly, record keeping. I know that record keeping is not the most favorite thing to do. You just like to, I think it's like this, I did it like this and that and that. But if you have it per note or just in a piece of paper and keep a nice logbook, then you can more or less see, okay, last year the condition was as this, it was with this amount of rainfall and nice sun and so on and so on. And then for instance, this farmer incorporated green cover crops, this type of legumes, and the result was good. And then in the end, he can start from that information to build up, be their own researcher in a way, and experiment with how to even make it more productive. So record keeping is important. Now here, I will go this over briefly. This is an example of a tropical cover crop selection chart, which is in the form of periodic table, because of course we would recommend for field officers or even growers if they have a nice Excel sheet instead of a periodic table. But just for the sake of visualization, this can nicely give an impression of how you would use such tools. So this is a periodic table, and you can find different types of information. First is about the tolerance, whether these plants are arranged based on left is more drought tolerant, whereas right is less drought tolerant. And then you have also information about the type of plant, whether it's grass or legumes. And you also have information about the use, whether these cover crops can be used also for human consumption, for forage, and also growth habits and growing duration. When we have this information, we don't directly think about which cover crops that I want to use. But just because I like sunham, then I just use sunham. But you have to understand first, if you are incorporating cover crops in your field, what is the problem that you're facing and what's your main objective, primary objective, then coming up with list of or a number of cover crops that are as options. As a checkpoint, I would like to ask this question. Which plants would you recommend based on this chart for cultivation if the condition of your field is under drought condition and you would like to use the cover crops for human consumption as well? So I have highlighted for sorghum, then cowpea, and then soybean. If you were that grower and would like to integrate or incorporate cover crops, which of these three would you opt for? Sorghum, cowpea, or soybean, based on the information you see in this table. And in such condition, when there's drought, in conditions, first, drought condition. So we would select plants that are more towards the drought tolerant. So it can be these grasses, these broadleaves, these legumes. This soybean is more situated more towards the non-drought tolerant. So then you have these two options, sorghum or cowpea. In terms of sorghum, you can see that it is a type of grass. It indeed it can be used for human consumption. And cowpea, you can also use it for human consumption, but then it's less drought tolerant and it's legume. So I would say that it depends. Do you want to grow grass or do you want to grow cowpea? But looking at this, if it is really drought condition that's really, really drought, I would opt for maybe grasses or maybe sunflower here, because it's also fitted for human consumption. In terms of legumes, if you have access to maybe pigeon pea, it's more drought tolerant. So cowpea is an option because I know like in Uganda produce a lot of cowpea as well. But if there's pigeon pea, maybe this is also one type of crop you would like to consider. So this is how you would try to use, and there's no right or wrong answer. There's a lot of preferences, but these are just examples that I like to demonstrate for you to understand how to use these kinds of tools. There was a question about some examples of how legumes would control different pests and diseases. So I've done a number of literature search, and interestingly, here you have velvet bean. This is an example image of velvet bean, and if you grow them, they help also reduce nematodes. Besides velvet beans, you also have sunham, which you can integrate as well to reduce nematode infestation in the soil. In this case, to reduce Colorado potato beetle, I don't know if CPB is an issue in tropical areas, but I know CPB is an issue here in the Netherlands where they grow a lot of potato. And here, by these researchers, they said that by growing crimson clover, it can help reduce Colorado potato beetles. And another example that it can, even if the legumes, they do not reduce, for instance, the diseases or the pests, but they can increase predatory ladybugs. This case is by faba beans. If you grow faba beans, you might see these ladybugs, but there are different types of ladybugs And some ladybugs are predatory, some ladybugs are actually pests. So you would have to also understand and identify what ladybugs are there. Another example is how legumes control different weeds. In this case, in the combination between maize and cowpea, can suppress striga. Also here in cropping between faba bean and oats, it suppresses orobangia. For growing hairy veg, it suppresses digitaria. So you can imagine that how do these legumes suppress weed coverage is because the coverage of the legumes, they grow fast and they cover the land. So of course, when it covers the soil and cover the land, there's not a lot of sun going below, and this also helps suppresses the weeds. This is a bit of example about cover crops when they are grown. And before maize, you have in this table control. In this case, they use goat manure as control, positive control. They also have inorganic fertilizer with a bit less concentration. And you have Lantana chamara, which is this nice flower. You often see this, I think, also in Asia and also in Africa. You have mucuna, and you have Tittonia. When you look at this table, this shows the maize grain yield ton per hectare harvested after grown fields that were applied with these different cover crops as well as manure. What's interesting is that Lantana chama, mucuna, and Tittonia, they do not perform as well in this case as goat manure, but maybe mucuna is slightly almost similar to goat manure in terms of the maize grain yield. But at least here for mucuna, it can replace inorganic fertilizer application. This can give a hint that, okay, you can also, this shows that you can try to, in the field, farmers can try to consider growing these types of cover crops, which are not, unfortunately, they are not in this case legumes, and they still provide nice nutrients when grown as green manure for the main crops to produce. And you can reduce the inorganic fertilizer. But then, especially for Tittonia and Lantana chamara, you see this a lot growing as weeds in the field. And this happens, why? Because they are not terminated properly. Anything that you don't want to grow in the field, those are considered weeds, and therefore there are a number of characteristics of how crop species can become weeds. They have hard seeds, they grow and set seeds quickly, they're difficult to control. So these are some characteristics, and therefore a plant can become weed. Even a tomato plant, when grown in a field of cabbage, is a weed. So you have to define in the end what is considered a weed and how to be able to terminate them correctly. And in termination process, there are a number of types of termination strategies, which include slashing, plowing, chemical control, using herbicides, which is not recommended, but it's the easy way. You also can do burning, because burning is quick and easy, but when not controlled properly, this can spread into other regions, especially when you're growing in peatland. I wouldn't want to burn anything there because you cannot see the fire there under the ground. So I would not consider burning as an option in peatlands. And in terms of that, a lot of growers, they hoe or just do manual hand pulling, which is manual work. And in this part, this is one of my last part, which is why investing in green manure cover crops. First of all, I would like to elaborate also that to determine the cost effectivity of GMCC as a solution is that what farmers want is how we can help farmers is that farmers, they do not want they want to get profit. They don't, in the end, it's, of course, everyone needs to get profit. So they, of course, think about how much investment, how much cost they have to pay. Is the return in the end substantial or sufficient or not sufficient? Because there are the cases also, especially in Indonesia, where farmers grow a lot of tomatoes, and because the prices go down, nobody is even harvesting the tomato and they're just left in the field. So we have to think that when a farmer would want to incorporate GMCC, have to be able to convince ask them what are the additional benefits, the indirect benefits that they also get. And of course, when related to cost, amount of labor, how much amount of labor do actually farmers have to invest? Because of course they have a lot of work to do on the side and they don't want additional effort, especially maybe in some areas that the farmers are, there's not a lot of young farmers, so you have a lot more older farmers, and then in the end, less labor. Yeah, a bit less labor. You have to consider that. With legume cover crops, it helps. Why? Because in the end, you don't have to invest a lot maybe on herbicides to prevent weeds from growing, because the cover crops nicely cover the soil and in the end suppresses the weeds. And in terms of no-tilling and minimal tilling, this is also an option of the cost effectiveness of GMCC, because maybe farmers do not have to plow too much of their field, and therefore in the end this is another benefit. Cost effectiveness in terms of intercropping, you can intercrop green manure also, but of course this strategy, you have to be able, like one would have to be able to understand or see and test in the field which combination suits and what additional benefits that they can obtain from the different combinations of intercropping. But there are examples where I will show later in the end, where farmers, they grow legumes in between coconut trees in coconut plantation. So they utilize the empty spaces to grow other crops, and not only for production but also for nutrients. Farmers, they can also harvest the seeds for the next growing season, and from the cover crops you can also show that they can maybe act as a repellent or attract beneficial insect, and in the end reduce the amount of herbicide spraying for weeds. Other reasons that can help you also convince farmers or growers to use cover crops is it's the versatile cultivation strategies. They can be grown into crop, planted as relay cropping. You can grow on wasteland or fields under fallow, but then it's in the end you don't have the field in the fallow state. Can be grown during the dry season or also under fruit trees or forest trees. And how can we convince the adoption of green manure cover crops? These are some examples or some points in which one can convince the adoption of green manure cover crops. You need to emphasize the benefits of using cover crops, develop tailored solutions, demonstrate the cost effectiveness through demonstration plots, also convince them about the labor efficiency. That for local knowledge sharing is very important to convince the usage of GMCC. Important to address concerns. Good to know of all these concerns, but then we know how to prevent it or how to tackle these challenges. Supportive policies and programs. Long-term sustainability, because when you invest in soil fertility, it's not a one-stop solution or a very short solution strategy. It's really investing and it needs time. So either you would like to look towards a sustainable solution for long-term, or something short, but it's not as sustainable as if it's not. And a continuous engagement, keep on promoting and also showing and demonstrating, and partnership and collaboration. How GMCC impact yield over time. This is an old literature that shows about the percentage of increase in maize and soybean yield after they have been planted after the legume cover crops. So over the years, you see that it's a positive trend. It's higher for soybean, but then in 2012, there's a high peak. And why is that? The authors found out that in that year there was a drought year. So you can imagine that legume cover crops, they're also as a buffer, especially in years where they have challenges. And they came up with a number of points where GMCC can really pay their way back more quickly, especially when farmers may be facing herbicide-resistant weeds, whether you want to use grazing the cover crops, soil compaction for transition to no-till, soil moisture deficit, and high fertilizer costs. And these are some points of why GMCC can pay back more quickly when you incorporate them in your production. And then now just a few examples of how GMCC is being implemented in different countries. This is an example of it's rather old already activity that has been done previously in Thailand, because I know nowadays KT has been doing a lot of effort in Thailand. So they have already started in the past doing relay cropping with maize, incorporating legumes in Sri Lanka. And what's interesting is that, taken for instance, in example in Thailand, there's so many diversity of legumes which you can explore and see the benefits also when you incorporate them not only as legume cover crops, but maybe also as medicinal plant. In the case for India, as I mentioned earlier, that sorghum, for instance, are also incorporated in coconut plantation. Not only sorghum, but also legumes. I think it was pigeon pea that was incorporated in between coconut plantation. And yes, maize and soybean, that is more often the case. Here I just presented in case anyone would like to capture BNF, which is the biological nitrogen fixation rates of, as I mentioned, how much of these plants can provide nitrogen, can fix nitrogen and provide them for the next crop. These are aligned from high to low. So you can imagine that groundnut it has a higher fixation rate, which means that it will take more time for it to provide the mineralization, which provide the nitrogen for the next crop compared to chickpea. And lastly, the implementation of GMCC in Nigeria. This is data which is an 8-year cumulative net benefit per year in southwestern Nigeria, where they grow maize, and they also grow maize after kudzu or maize after siam weed. And these are 2 pictures of kudzu and siam weed. And interestingly, when they grow after siam weed, there does not seem that much different when you just grow them maize as itself. But when you grow them with kudzu, there's really a significant benefit that farmers in this experiment that they obtained, which means that could be because siam weed, maybe they incorporated it not at the right stage, or maybe because it in the end was still insufficient for the maize. The nitrogen was still insufficient for the maize. So there's of course a lot of factors in order to dissect why this bar graph is relatively, this graph shows relatively the same amount of net benefit. So in conclusion, cultivating resilience in agriculture to green manure cover crop is a key strategy. And on the right side is more of a comprehensive view, or just a general overview also about there are lots of elements that a grower would have to consider for crop production, as disease management, nutrient management. And if you incorporate green manure cover crops, you would also have to consider about mineralization. And of course, this all would have to lead to economic value that will be profitable for the farmers. And the second point is this approach, which is adding the green manure cover crops, it enhances soil health, increase soil crops yields, strengthen climate, economic, and social resilience for farmers. But of course, it's not an instant solution. It needs time and investment and persistency and consistency to apply and to make it better, to adapt it better in different regions as well over time. Lastly, successful implementation. It requires careful selection of the management practices. And of course, adapting one strategy in one location may not be 100% the same in another location. Even in Uganda, between Terego and Lira, were two experiments that were conducted there. They were similar, but in the end, due to climate differences or weather differences and conditions, this yielded different results. So this is why it's important during the implementation phase that you can learn from different settings or different demonstrations and different experiments, especially different farmers' experience, but you have to be able to adapt it and make it your own. And this what makes it challenging but exciting. So these are the last conclusions from me, and I hope there's still 5 more minutes if there are a few questions that you would like to ask. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Micha, for sharing your expertise on green manure. Aside from learning about the initial results that we have currently on our ongoing green manure projects in KT Learning Farms in India, Uganda, Ghana, and Nigeria. I think this webinar has enriched our understanding of how this practice benefits our field activities with smallholder farmers. And I just had a chat from Herman that the questions were really great, and it also helps us, helps him later on navigate on how to improve this system together. So thank you everyone for the questions. Really, I'm overwhelmed, but I'm happy that you had a lot of questions about this topic. Most of it were answered already by Herman. Thank you very much, Dr. Herman, for your inputs. We still have a few, although to be answered by Micha. Still have 3 minutes. We have one comment actually from our Facebook viewer, Yan Samnang, that sorghum takes more time to transplant, and the seed also is very costly. So what would be the alternative? From the list that you've presented, from the table that you've presented, what could be the next best option?
You need to look, this list is just a general list. It's not the ultimate list. So I would suggest to look at what is available. And I urge, therefore, the KT team, if you would also be able to provide these kinds of legume cover crop selection tool, because I don't know in the region of the person who is asking has all the suggested crops and there are different tools available, because in this case it's only related to drought tolerance, but there are other examples that we are preparing now, this online LMS course on cover crops, where there are more examples that we provide there as a to give an impression. But again, for instead of sorghum, I don't know, maybe sesame if you have there.
From Cambodia, so I think we can also proceed with the with our your suggestion, if we can have mapping first of what are the available, so we can include in the selection of good option as a green manure. Thank you very much, Samnang. There's 2 more, I think, questions from Ate Malin. What is an example of best green manure crop, which is also an effective soil biofumigant? Mustard is known as having a biofumigant property. Can this also be used as a green manure? When is the right timing to plant this in the field?
Yeah. So biofumigants are actually to prevent fungal, and as far as I know, brassicasses are nice biofumigants, but of course depends on which brassicase. So you have to look again on what are available, which type of brassicase, because for that I need to look again on what are you trying to prevent, what kind of what are you trying to tackle. But in the case of legume cover, so for green manure cover crops, you can use like a lot of selection of crops within those different types of categories, and what is available. And I think it's also nice if you look at, for instance, the companion cropping and maybe get a hint from that, the information from the companion crop. You would not want to grow legumes with onions together, and you would not want to grow, for instance, maize after maybe tomato, like that. So these kinds of information, it's really specific. You would have to look it up again.
And there's an additional point from Herman actually to answer. So please look at the comment of our Herman. Thank you very much, Herman. If there are no other questions, but I would like to conclude this session with a question from Rutger. Actually, you've mentioned that in some of your slides, but I think it's nice to have this in conclusion from your side. How can we convince the smallholder farmers that there really is a business case behind investing into green manuring cover crops instead of regular commercial crops?
I think in terms of green manure cover crops, you again think about it not as direct profit. Think it as indirect profit, so you would be able to mitigate maybe certain, as I mentioned before in the slide, that if there are certain case of sudden drought or sudden problems infested, then this can act as a buffer. So this is one way in which you can also convince farmers to use, so having cover crops as a buffer. And but if it's not the case, then you can also think of cover crops that you can harvest the product, but having that, you can also consider that you're not putting all the maximum nutrients back in the soil. Maybe then you can decrease the amount of fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer that you use or that you apply. That can help. And maybe also mixing it with compost. That is, or manure. That can be also a strategy. But then it's again related to pressing or minimizing the amount of fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer in the field.
Thank you. I think that also relates to what Herman already mentioned there.
Okay.
That if you can recommend lower N rates to the crops, it will result in less costs for chemical and fertilizers. So that's great. Thank you very much, everyone. Before I end this one, please, if you can click the link for your feedback. This helps us really to improve our webinar, just like what we did now with the questions that were mentioned from the last feedback. Thank you very much. And also the timing, we added time, so it's good that we added time. It also welcome more questions. It's very interesting questions, very interesting topic, and very good expertise from Micha and also from Herman behind the scene. Thank you very much for all the answers. If you also are holding your camera or anything or your phone, you can also scan the QR code for the feedback form. So thank you very much, Micha. Thank you, everyone. Terima kasih, Dr. Micha. And thank you to our participants who stayed with us until the end here in Zoom and also in our Facebook live stream. That's the end of our episode. Do you have any questions you would like to be answered in the future episodes or topics that you would like to learn more about? Leave your questions or suggestions or on the feedback form or contact our technical support hub members in your country. Stay tuned for the next episode of Around the VegTable. Curious about vegetables? Talk to Iswe Seed. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Micha.
Thank you. Bye.